don't know.
That clock is wrong.
Oh, is it?
It's
oh,
2 o'clock.
It's 2 o'clock. Brilliant. Right. Bang on time. That's appropriate. All right. So this is the neurodivergent panel. Thank you for sticking around. I think we're one of the last panel today, along with Making Worlds, isn't it? So thanks very much for joining us. Today I am joined by an excellent panel. We have Susie Williamson, we have Benjamin Unsworth, and we have Kit Whitfield. And we're all going to chat neurodivergence. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to have quite an informal, I'm going to try and keep it informal, just have a conversation, and hopefully cover some very interesting points. And I know for a fact that they've all got very interesting things to say. I'm Emily Inken, and yeah, I'm a writer, I'm a neurodivergent myself, and it's a very interesting brain to inhabit, especially when it comes to writing experiences and, you know, all of those things. I'm going to allow my panel to introduce themselves. So, would you like to start, Susie?
I'm Susie Williamson. I'm the author of the fantasy series Bloodgift Chronicles, published by Stairwell Books. I also write short stories, mostly in the horror and weird fiction genre. I write poetry on different themes, and I'm also an artist. I'm neurodivergent, unlabelled, following an acquired following an illness.
I'm Benjamin Unsworth. I'm autistic and I'm a horror writer with a few short stories out there and an obsession with Doctor Who that borders like unhealthy.
I'm Kit Whitfield. I'm the author of, most recently, the Gaiaford series, published by Joe Fletcher Books. I'll get into my neuro thingness with the next question.
Excellent. Yeah, okay, I think we can definitely expand on that, hopefully. So my first question I thought would be great to kick things off with is, do you write neurodivergent experiences, and to what extent do these experiences represent your own? Which is not necessarily a simple answer. So would you like to take it away, Kit?
Okay, well, I am a member of a neurodiverse family. Both my family of origin is neurodiverse. I am married to a man with ADHD. I am the mother of an autistic boy who also has ADHD. And for myself, I've probably got a little bit of spice in my sauce, but I've never been assessed. I have some dyspraxia traits. But I'm also one of those people who has a surprisingly large number of neurodiverse friends just by coincidence. The Gaiaford series, which is the most obviously neurodiverse series, I suppose, is the premise is that there's an old superstition that iron repels fairies and spirits, and so this is about the iron workers, fairy smiths, also known as farriers, who work with iron that deals with it when the fae spirits are troubling you. Now, part of the influence of my family is that the way I have fae characters thinking is very influenced by living in a household where everybody has a different kind of brain. And so living alongside people who don't think like you is something that happens to all of us. And I also make quite an issue of characters who, in the language of the time, are referred to as touched, but you could read them as just magically touched if you're not in the club, but if you are neurodiverse yourself, you're likely to find something about them familiar. And looking back, I think that the reason I did it primarily was because this is a less understood thing if people are not in the life, but there's a lot about living in a neurodiverse family that's just really funny. You know, all families laugh at each other somewhat, or at least one hopes affectionately. And if you're neurodiverse, you laugh at each other's differences. And yes, so?
Point of language.
Yes.
An individual is neurodivergent.
Did I say
your family is neurodiverse because you've all got different neurotypes, but you as an individual neurodivergent?
I beg your pardon, slip of the tongue, but just.
It's just so.
No, I'm just going to repeat.
confused.
No, you're right. I'm going to repeat that in case there's a live stream and it wasn't picked up what was said. Rosemary kindly reminded me that neurodivergent refers to an individual and neurodiverse to a group, and I got them muddled up. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, I think I wanted to write about the joy and the humour and the vitality that comes from living in a diverse group. The sensory vibrance of neurodivergence, the warmth that comes from loving people who are unlike yourself, the funny side of things, because very often we see it represented as a problem, but I love my family, and a lot of the time we really have fun, and I think I wanted to put that joy into the writing, as well as having monsters eat people who are nasty to people with special needs. So that's where I'm coming from, I think.
Yeah.
So I've been neurodivergent. I think the first assessment I had that was talked about was when I was about 7, and for as long as I can remember, I'd been described as an old man in a young man's body. So I think it's definitely always been with me in some form. So the characters I write, I think I do put my experiences into them, but not deliberately. Because I think horror lends itself actually quite nicely in the sense that horror and that often kind of your fight or flight response, which you get in horror, you often get if you're neurodivergent, i.e. if you're stressed out by a social situation or so on. So I think the feeling that you get as an autistic person, you could give to a normal person just in a fight or flight horror situation. I decided to put bits of me in, which is a guy who becomes before I started to put myself into it, it's just like a guy who's finding coincidences everywhere, like his money making £3 and the time being 3 o'clock at the same time, and he was really creeping him out. But by the end, it had become stuff like he was counting the paving stones and he couldn't walk down a street if it was an uneven number of paving stones, which I'm not saying I can't walk down a street if there's an uneven number of paving stones, but I do almost annoy myself because I'll walk along and I don't want to do it. And it's almost like I get annoyed at myself because even I don't know why I do it. And like, you know when you do the childish game, like, don't step on the cracks, and it's kind of like that. And I'm like, it's almost like, right, so if there's a crack along the paving stone, does it become uneven? Do I count it as 2 paving stones? Do I count it as 1 and step over the crack to bridge it? And so there are like very weird things that go on, that kind of obsession with something that's really quite minuscule I put into this character. That's at least the most obvious one I can think of. But I think, as I said before, horror as itself lends itself to that otherness. And so probably the very fact of writing horror, there is otherness in there, and that, even if you're not a neurodivergent writer, you will be putting otherness in there that an autistic person or an ADHD person will go, oh yeah, I see that in there.
Yeah, that's interesting because obviously you're writing otherness in terms of species and sort of the fairy and then you're writing it as a horror. There is ways of introducing otherness that are very different here, but you know, yeah.
I mean, it's an unfair term, but it's the that other
yeah.
is one that's at least historically recognised.
Yeah. Susan?
Well, I mean, just briefly, maybe slightly different. So as an acquired something, I had a critical illness a few years ago, and I had to be put into an induced coma for a prolonged period of time, and so then there was recovery from severe polyneuropathy, which affected mobility. Cognitive function was impaired by a lack of oxygen to the brain and trauma, and other weird and wonderful things like coordination, and so it's all kind of unlabelled, and it's all sort of generalised and raised its head in weird and wonderful ways that have had to kind of come come to understand. I write fantasy, and so when I started writing, it was before my illness, and so I didn't set out with an intention to write neurodiverse characters. But when I look back and reflect on some of my characters, there's a lot that I also recognise. I've got a character who was impacted by childhood trauma, and he has an uncanny ability with animals. He can speak with animals, he can shift perspective entirely, and he finds his sense of belonging in the world by the natural world. That's his sense of belonging. I have a character who has a unique connection with a crystal, and it's like rocks, stones, minerals, and being used to find grounding from anxiety and mental health issues. She also, as part of her ability, her senses become very heightened, and so she becomes very focused on colour and form, and that's part of her sort of magical gift. And then I have a character who has strange and terrifying visions of dragons, and she was the one character who, at the time of writing, I knew what I was doing, because it was a bit of a pushback on hospital delirium that I had prolonged. So yeah, I mean, writing can be a very revealing process, even to yourself. Yeah, so there's a lot of inspiration there, but similarly with fantasy and sort of writing, you know, magic and other creatures and out of this world experiences, there are ways of othering and you know, finding safe places to explore things, I think.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure what the name of the condition is, but it's where you automatically think in terms of colour.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's like, if I don't think I have that, but if a writer had that, I imagine that would give a very unique perspective, because whereas you're trying to put words on a page, you're thinking in a completely different medium.
I think I'm also an artist, so I think a lot of my stuff is unlabelled and always has been, but I'm also an artist, and in my writing, I've always been a very visual writer, and there's always been a lot of recognisable colour in the writing. And since my illness, my vividness on the world has been multiplied tenfold, and that's recognisable in my writing, and also in my artwork as well. It's one of it's probably the only positive, because I quite enjoy that perspective. So yeah.
I think I've actually, you know, listening to you, I had a very well, not very similar experience, but my own like medical sort of complexity. I'm epileptic. And back in 2016, I had a series of big seizures. One of them happened. I was not diagnosed with epilepsy then, and then I had two big ones on the same day. Temporal lobe completely fried. You know, real fireworks going on in there. It was a bit catastrophic. So things changed in my brain after that.
Yeah.
And I looked this up, because, you know, obviously when things are changing in your brain, it's quite disconcerting, and you want to know, and it happens over a long period of time as well, like things don't become apparent for a while. And apparently when you have a massive burnout in the temporal lobe, you know, in one, your neural pathways, sort of while they're repairing the temporal lobe, can multiply in other places to sort of like, you know, bypass. And this can happen in the frontal cortex, and that's the communication and sort of, you know, communication areas of the brain. And it wasn't until after my seizures that I really started writing, and I'd always been a writer, but then after my seizures, a little while after, suddenly it was all happening and everything fell into place, and then my world and my book became like a subject of interest. It was complete obsession, complete. And I mean, it's not really gone away. This is like a long-term condition, I think. But yeah, I mean, that kind of before and after a medical kind of physical trauma.
It's very recognisable to me what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, you notice the difference. You can see the massive change yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting, but also not necessarily negative. I personally, yes, it was a horribly traumatic experience, but I wouldn't go back because my brain is different now and I like it. So I'm wondering, you know, obviously this is a very personal experience, you know, like how do we feel about these brains that we inhabit, you know, and yeah, Kit, go for it.
Well, as to my own brain, I would love it if I could go down a flight of stairs without a rail to hold on to. I could have done without all those humiliations in PE lessons. It would be nice to have handwriting I could read. You know, if I could dance, that would be nice.
Sure.
PE is hell.
Yeah, generally.
I was like 44 before I realised some people actually enjoy sports because it's fun to do a thing your body can do. That's how long it took me to work out. But I wouldn't swap my writing for any of them. And I noticed something when editing my last couple of books, which is that I try to be a cooperative editee while being tiresomely picky. I think I'm what they call particular, if people can hear them, and fussy or picky. But when there were changes suggested, I would go, okay, we can do this, but I need to add another word because of the rhythmic needs of the sentence. Or, no, I can't take out that comma, it's important for the balance. Rhythm, balance. These are things I am not good at in real life. And I think what I did was I poured my grace onto the page where I didn't need my body. And as a result, I mean, I am what they call a flowery stylist. But yeah, I think that my brain created, I mean, I also grew up in a family that because of the various things going on was kind of chaotic. And writing became the place where I could make it, I could go somewhere quiet and make it as I wanted. So no, I wouldn't trade my writing for anything. I would lose anything about me before I lost my writing. And my writing is so influenced by my own brain and also the experiences of living with ADHD fils and père, and the sense of humour you have to grow about that. That I would say that for my own part, the pleasures outweigh the pains, or at least the things I grew to work around it became more important to me than the things I was working around.
Yeah, makes absolute sense. Yeah.
Just before I answer the question, the thing you were saying before about temporal lobe epilepsy, there's a history of what the kind of scientists, when they look back to religious experiences, have often been rationed as. So it's kind of like, if they're so creative, they can make you supposedly see God.
Well, it was a double-edged. You were either a witch and burned to the stake, or you were so holy that you were having visions, and it was one or the other. It was extremes.
Or often both.
Yeah, you were screwed either way, really.
Yeah,
You got tased by the muse.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm kind of glad to be born in this era and not the other one. Especially as I'm asthmatic, I can't run very fast, and I think that would have been an excellent skill.
I don't know, it would help if you're being drowned underwater, though. Either way.
Really, I think I would have had a very short and traumatic life. Yes.
No, but now to actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
A big thing for me is when I'm writing stories is plot holes. Is I'm both very aware of them when I'm watching and reading stuff.
Yes.
But there's also the sense that, like, even if your story is something very simple, like A to B to C, it's got to have a logical consistency to me. So if I'm writing, because I don't write fantasy really, I mean, it's all up here ready to, I don't really. But when I write a story, there's about 90% of stuff that doesn't reach the page, but the entire world is imagined in my head. And because I also think the kind of the accidental bonus of that is it gives it quite a lot of reality to it, in the sense that you can drop in little references, and because you know where they've come from exactly, you can put them in, and it seems real, because in real life we do put references that not many people might get. And I think it makes my writing seem, and this isn't me like trying to brag, but these are in the sense that lots of people read it and go, no, cut that into 3 different sentences. Because in my head, I'm able to track where all the different clauses and commas and so on are. But other people are just like, no, no, no. And like, to me, it's just so simple. Like, well, that comma connects to that one because that's why don't you understand that? And so a lot of my editing is just going through, either people wouldn't speak like that because I'm putting the way I speak in there, or going through and going, no, people aren't going to understand that because you've made one sentence last 9 lines.
That's very Dickens.
Yeah, but it's not. That's what people describe as like was Victorian writing sometimes.
Yes.
I'm just dying to ask you something before we move on to Susie, if you'll forgive me, Susie. One thing I've heard some neurodivergent people say is that the feeling of needing to mask, because if people uncover who you are, they will be hostile, can lead to a somewhat horror-ish feel of being surrounded by aliens, or surrounded by people who are not like you and possibly a threat to you. Is that something that comes into horror for you?
Not necessarily into. I mean, I know the horrible feeling of having to mask. If nothing else, not because I necessarily want to, but like for instance, I wear something, and like the uncomfortable nature is people do give you odd looks because you don't look normal. And so there's the thick skin approach, which is a kind of masking, even though you're being yourself. It's just that no, it doesn't bother me, even though it does.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But then there's also the vice versa approach of you're having to sometimes pretend to be someone you're not, which actually, even if you are able to do that, I find it then means like at the end of the day, you're like, for God's sake, just let me sit down and have 10 minutes in my own brain where my own brain can go insane. So I think maybe that reaches the page when I'm writing, again, inadvertently. But I don't think I've necessarily written it in deliberately, but I do recognise that the horror, as it were, of masking.
The ongoing exhaustion.
Yeah, I think it's called burnout.
Oh yeah.
And so it's kind of, and how do you explain to someone stuff like, I need to take my shoes off because I can feel my feet. Like, how do you explain that to someone?
Yeah.
I remember in the middle of one of my drama lessons, that's all that you did. Just like, took my shoes off, threw them across the room. And I wasn't thinking about it because it was just like, no, that's how I know I need to deal with it. And everyone else just looked around like, are you okay? And I was just like, yeah, it was just my feet. It's like, what about your feet? Well, they're there. how do you quite explain to someone the fact that you can feel bits of you? And it's not like I could chop off my foot. I wasn't going to saw it.
They would have probably asked you more intently if you were okay if you'd suddenly taken a sword to your feet.
Yeah, just like, get a chainsaw from my bag. But then the question why I had a chainsaw. No, I'm going down a tangent.
Though I think this is one of the joys of neurodivergence, the tangents.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah.
Why go in a straight line? It's boring.
Susie.
The tangents are great, but I've got a terrible memory. What was the
Oh.
question?
I'm so sorry.
No, don't be sorry. Your answers are so interesting, but I'm lost. What
Okay,
was
so
the question?
the question was, do we like our brains,
Okay.
really? And how is our relation to our brains in relation to our work? And do we like it? Would we change it?
So I started by saying that I've always kind of been quite a visual writer, see things quite vividly and in colour, but following the illness it became much more vivid, so what you were talking about with your brain was resonating with me. I can notice that difference. I mean, in terms of who I am in every aspect, I wouldn't change any part of who I am because then I wouldn't be who I am. And so I couldn't say that I'd want to change something, but do I like every aspect of it? No, because some of it's really flipping difficult. My memory has been massively impacted. I have what I've come to think of as black spots. I call them my black spots. It's just my term, where I can just get completely lost. So now if I'm reading a book, I can't read a book without taking notes because I can't follow it. If I'm watching TV or a movie, I'm constantly rewinding it or stopping everybody and saying, okay, just recap the last 20 minutes because I got lost. If I'm in a conversation, I might just completely forget what's been going on or have a complete void on the last few sentences. This was to the point where when I was in hospital there was concern over whether or not I'd be able to write, which was alarming, because I would have probably forgotten most things and not that. Incidentally, very fortunately for me, the only thing I can remember in absolute detail is the content of my story. And if I had to pick up any book I've written and somebody said, you know where that thing I would just be able to find a page, and that's where it happened. And that's the only thing I can remember. And my lovely publisher is in the audience, and when I came out of hospital, I'd been working on a book beforehand, and the words, I don't know if you can still write, were like, that's unacceptable to me. So I went home and I just quickly picked up my books and rewrote the book. And it was much sharper, and it was much more vivid and much more colourful. It was a better story after the rewrite. But no, I'm not happy about the memory lapse. I'm not happy about my vacancy. Sometimes I get misread as being lazy and sociable. This is also because I get a lot of fatigue and some bodily issues as well. So I get misread, and yeah, you're in a bad mood, you're grumpy, you're unsociable, you're not communicating, you're being sullen, or you're being aloof, or no. I have just got no idea what's going on in this moment. I'm completely vacant, and I'm trying to just manage, and I'm trying to think about what does my next step need to look like so that I can keep moving forward and do the things that I need to do. So that's difficult, but I wouldn't change anything about who I am because I kind of like my life.
There's
No.
something.
In that vein, there's also the stuff about when people say, "Oh, you can't use it as an excuse." It's kind of, but then they say there's the whole reason excuse. It's kind of like, to them it seems obvious, but to us it's like, we can't separate. Because to us it's like kind of, I'm not saying it necessarily excuses what I'm doing, but it's still the logic behind what you're doing.
There's an intolerance, and I think because it's about having, I'm going to have like an invisible physical disability as well, and there are two very similar strands of disbelief and intolerance, which is really difficult to manage, because you can look like you're very physically able and all the rest of it. So yeah, the misreading is difficult. It makes life difficult to manage, and much more scheduled and routined and organised and methodical about things. And then I get back into my writing, and I can just, life gets easier when I'm in the mode of writing, because there's a lot more flexibility.
Yeah, see, this is what I'm hearing. I mean, Ben, you were saying that when you're in your world, everything is just vivid, and you're saying that when you're in your worlds, everything is easier. And I find both of those things resonate very, very strongly with me. And I mean, I write audio drama. I have a producer who I work with, and he freaks out at my lack of note-taking. And I've got a very scrappy spreadsheet that I do not fill in very much. It's very haphazard, but it's all in here. And for me, it's fact. And I try to explain it to him. I'm like, well, you don't go around writing down what a daisy looks like because you know what a daisy looks like. I'm like, I don't write down what that particular thing in my world looks like because I know what it looks like.
I creeped out a drama teacher doing that.
Yeah.
Where, because I knew she was going to print out all the PowerPoints, I'd only make really minimal notes because I don't want to go, well, there's the notes there, I'm not going to rewrite them again. That wasn't even like, that was just being practical. I'm not going to rewrite the same notes twice, that's stupid. And she was like, hey, you've hardly written anything. It's like, well, trust me, you'll print out that. And like, she talked to my SEN and like, and I was like, trust me. And as it happened, but next essay I happened to get the highest mark for that one. Anyway, and it was just like, I told you.
I told you, this is fine.
No, I'm not saying that works all the time, but it was just like in that moment, sometimes like, you might not understand, but trust me, I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And I think a vivid inner life is something that a lot of neurodivergent people have.
And I think it's also difficult to explain to people. When you're writing, I find people think that it looks like work, right? For me, that's when I'm recharging, because that's when my brain is at its most natural, almost. And so I recharge by writing and disappearing into my world, because I find that being in the real world is such an effort, because I'm not able to be in my own world. Like, my natural state is my own world, and to be present is like, it's a real effort sometimes, especially at work. I mean, God, you know, like it's just like hard adulting.
I think there's a
Yeah.
comfort in having also worlds created for you. So my big obsession, as I said at the very start, is Doctor Who. If you're on the Doctor Who panel yesterday, you saw it, like, I think you would have seen a little bit of that. So in my head, like, okay, I know I'm not a Tom Baker, and I know I'm not John Pertwee wearing the multi-wings, etc., etc., etc. But sometimes when being me gets a bit difficult, being able to put on the velvet jacket or the long scarf and just be, or at least know that I can fall back into it because I know them better than I know myself, is sometimes a bit, well, not a bit, really quite comforting.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've got a lot of notes here, but we've sort of just been chatting. But I mean, one of the things I did want to talk about was potentially, like, you know, our experiences reading and seeing neurodivergent, neurodiverse characters in the literature that we read, and whether we got any bugbears about that, and whether we, you know, have seen tropes that come back that are problematic, and, you know, or when things are done really, really well, and it's been refreshing, because I mean, there's nothing like reading a book when you're seeing yourself like echoed back. And I mean, for my part, I think it's funny when people who are neurotypical read a character and don't pick up on the fact that they're neurodivergent, and you're reading it and thinking, well, obviously they are, and they're just not picking up on it. And I think it's like you say, it's an invisible condition, and people just are very good at ignoring it. And you know, people who don't have these things, but you spot the signs very easily. I remember having a panel. It was sci-fi representation of neurodivergent characters in science fiction, and the conclusion was, you know, it was like, there aren't any. And I said, I was like, there are lots of characters who are displayed as being on a spaceship on their own with nothing but a computer to keep them company, and they're fine. Yeah,
They're just really well accommodated.
I mean, yeah, it could be about. I'm just like, yeah, exactly. It's like, yeah, it doesn't necessarily need to be said at that point, does it? I mean, but yeah, okay. Do we have any like examples of characters, or like any thoughts about how, you know, anything that's resonated or just really jarred in the things that we've read? And you know, do you look like you want to jump in there?
Well, I'm probably not. I mean, I think I am the entiest person in my house. So a lot of what I see is watching stuff with my husband and him going, oh, like most recently, Lockwood and Co. ADHD, I love that guy. He's got ADHD and he's got an autistic best friend. I love this. And or watching JoJo's Bizarre Adventure with him and him going, Jotaro, I don't know if you've any of you seen JoJo's Bizarre Adventure or read it, but there's a character who basically lives as Clint Eastwood, and he's very, very taciturn and an incredible magic-using badass. And if you just switch strong and silent to minimally verbal, suddenly a lot makes sense. I think I would. It's not science fiction, so I will spare you my rant on the curious incident in the dog in the nighttime. But I think the main thing I would say is that the best representations I've seen have tended to be either by people who are neurodivergent themselves, or they are accidental representations where they've written a person rather than a condition, and because neurodivergent people are people, this one has a lot of very recognizable traits. I think, especially when neurotypical people try to write neurodivergent people, the worst thing to do is to look at the external behaviours and then think, well, why would I be behaving like that if I was behaving like that? And put neurotypical reasons into the mind of a neurodivergent person, because the fact is, you wouldn't be behaving like that because you don't have that kind of brain. And because you don't have that kind of brain, you don't know why somebody is doing those things. There is a different logic and a different aesthetic to every neurotype, and you can't reimagine them from the outside.
Yeah, I mean, you've hit on exactly almost what I was going to say. The fact that the accidental. So my favourite book is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I mean, or at least it's the one that I find comfort reading. My favourite one's The Shining, though that's possibly Danny Torrance with his The Shining. But Hitchhiker's Guide, I don't think it's deliberate, but if Arthur Dent isn't autistic, I'll buy a hat shop and eat it. If nothing else, because the thing's like, okay, it's kind of not deliberate, but the fact that he's in his dressing gown the entire time, that creature comforts. It's kind of like he doesn't want necessarily not want to have his house demolished because he like particularly is settled living there. It's just he knows where everything is. And so it's stuff like that. And yeah, so that kind of accidental is something that I think is very right. And it is quite fun when kind of in real life when people don't know they're neurodivergent, but they're usually their entire friend group is. And it's kind of like, and it's, I remember when I told my friends that I was like, oh, I've just been diagnosed with autism, and they kind of, half of them just looked at me and went, oh, really? And it was kind of like they knew before. It's like you've got these 2-year waiting lists. It's like, no, what you need is about 3 people to walk up to you and go, yep. And so actually I think it's almost the fun of it being accidental, finding these people and going, they are my people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not horror or sci-fi or anything, but Hannah Gadsby, her Netflix specials, it was kind of, she just hit it right on the head for me. I started watching the first one like 10 o'clock at night, and it was like I did all of them before even realising it was like, hey, it's 1 AM now. And so again, it was that, you know, sometimes people can just hit it right on the head.
Yeah.
I'm reading a book at the moment called The Speed of Dark by Elizabeth Boone. I don't know if anybody's read that or heard of it. And it's essentially a kind of sci-fi futuristic where science has been trying to eradicate anything deemed to be a genetic default. But there was a misgeneration, so the main character's of the misgeneration, and he's high-functioning, autistic, mostly independent, sees a counsellor once a year, has been taught to fit in, smile, shake hands.
Once a year, because that's enough, isn't it?
And then the question comes that he's offered a treatment to reverse the impacts of autism. So your question earlier about would you change who you are, and so he thinks about, would I still see colour and pattern in the same way? Would I still look the same person? And so it kind of confronts that question head on around the idea of, what apparent normal society thinks and whether things should be cured. It comes up a lot with physical disability as well. So it's quite an interesting take on that. I was thinking, I read somewhere recently about, which really resonated with me, both from my own personal experience and also I spent many years working as a support worker for people with disabilities and low functioning autistic people and various conditions. And the idea about the assumptions that people make on us and the challenges, the challenges of high functioning people being denied and the strengths of low functioning people being denied, and so those kinds of assumptions from wider society on neurodiversity. And yes, I kind of like to see representation that challenges some of those assumptions, I guess. I was thinking about An Unkindness of Ghosts by Rivers Solomon, sci-fi about a generationship organised like the Antebellum South, and the main character Astaire, and she's she can kind of make something out of nothing. She's everybody's go-to. And she really challenges the idea that somebody with, she reads as autistic and somebody with, that kind of neurodiversity, the assumption that autistic people struggle to have sort of genuine, true emotional connections, you know, that kind of awful
the Sherlock
stereotype. Yeah.
high functioning,
Yeah.
they don't need friends trope.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Although the original Sherlock Holmes is actually a really lovely, friendly guy.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so this woman is, you know, she plays a massively central role in everybody's life. I mean, she's completely connected to everybody, more than anybody else, and has, you know, amazing in-depth conversations with friends around really intricate conversations around non-conforming gender and all kinds of stuff, and to the point where she impacts people also in the higher quarters. You know, she's a very prominent character and very courageous. I was thinking about Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler as well, and Lauren, she has hyperempathy and the kind of strength of that condition which really helps her to survive, and not just herself, but she becomes a community leader. She helps other people to survive and develops her own philosophy that secures future survival as well. So some real strengths in people that would be, you know, deemed to be high functioning. But I was also thinking, I don't know what people think about this character, but I was also thinking about the character in Game of Thrones, Odor, and that kind of the lack of, you know, the sort of low functioning, minimal communication skills. I've certainly worked with people who had really strong relationships with, who had very little verbal communication, and I quite appreciated the sort of the variety of different kinds of communication that we have, and the fact that somebody like that character, he was central in people's lives, and he held people that he knew in great esteem. He was seen in great esteem. I was a little bit perturbed by the fact that he had to sacrifice himself. I would have liked to have seen him thrive. But I thought there was some interesting stuff around his character.
I do think
And
I do think it's very unfortunate though, and this isn't limited to fantasy or anything, it's always the bad representation that everyone seems to cotton onto rather than the good representation. And the thing that got me thinking about it is, you know, when you talk about a cure for neurodivergence, there was a charity called Autism Speaks.
Oh yes.
And they had as their badge a jigsaw piece. So the implication was there was a bit missing. They didn't put it in, and they had in, I think, until about 2018, in their mission statement, they were going to find a cure for autism. I wear one that's just the Autism Society, and it's just an A, but with the spectrum of colours. And so, because obviously an A is one big, and I much prefer that one. But it was just Autism Speaks is the one that I always hear talked about, but I never hear just the Autism Society talked about.
It's a perception, other people's perception, you know, other people putting another. It's similar. I mean, people with, you know, the sort of lots of conversation around people who use wheelchairs and cannot walk, and the apparent, you know, we have to cure them so that they can walk. I mean, what they
Make
can walk
them normal.
a couple of steps and in a lot of pain, or they can bum around in a wheelchair. You're putting your own perspective on somebody else.
It's
And something I've noticed, knowing people with a variety of neurodivergences, is that the attitude to a cure, I mean, I don't see how you could cure autism without a magic wand. It would just be turning somebody into somebody else. It is that there are, I mean, everybody's different, but some divergences are more wanted by the people who have them than others. Like, my experience, which I can't speak for everyone, but my experience is that most autistic people, if you say, would you like to be made not autistic, they're like, no, get away from me, you're trying to kill the real me. A lot of people with ADHD, if you say, if I offered you a cure for ADHD, would you hate, don't bite my hand off? Because a lot of people with ADHD would like to be rid of it because it prevents them from doing things that they themselves want to do. So, again, I think the different conditions do make a difference. And another thing I'd like to say about I forget what it was you said that sparked it off, but you were making interesting remarks, both of you. And I think it was what you were saying, that the representations that we see in fiction, it's not just that the bad ones tend to be the ones that catch on. We need to think about the effect that that has on people who are approaching a diagnosis, either for themselves or for somebody that they are responsible for. Like, I've met at least one person who, if they're not autistic, I will eat the rubble of your Eden hat shop. But because they have the idea that autism means that you're not empathic, they resist this diagnosis. And this makes them more vulnerable in certain ways. I won't go into details because that's their business. Here's a story. The day my son was diagnosed with autism, he was 3, I was exhausted. I loved him with every cell of me, and I didn't know if he loved me because he didn't show with his body that he was taking in anything I was saying. I later found out he's the most loving person in the world, but I didn't know it at that point. And a lot of what I had read about autism, trying to inform myself, had presented autistic people as people who are emotionally disconnected. So I was sitting there thinking, oh my God, is this person I love more than anything in the world ever going to love me back? And the diagnostician said, so have you seen The Big Bang Theory? And I said, yes, it's on just after I put him to bed and then collapsed. And he said, well, Sheldon Cooper, that's an autistic person. And I said, but he's horrible. Yeah. And I now realise Sheldon Cooper is a very crude portrait of...
It's every autistic trait rolled into one.
And also somebody who's an adult who acts like an autistic child. He doesn't act like an autistic adult. But this was me being told, come on, it's encouraging. Your son is going to be comically inconsiderate and rude and annoying and really hard to live with. And, you know, my son is direct. He says what he thinks. But so many of these images in my head were basically, your son has got arsehole condition and he will never love you. It's fortunate that I thought, right, I'm going to say I love you to him 20 times a day because I don't know if he's ever listening and I want at least one to go in. Turns out they all went in, but I didn't know that at the time.
You probably know exactly how many times.
Well, he says it all the time now.
He's got a little chart under the bed where he's been tracking it.
No, he's also got ADHD, he wouldn't remember where it was. But yeah, I think if we're worried about autistic children, then we do need to try to be aware of portrayals that could alienate their families from them at a time when those kids desperately need love and care. It can damage families if we let the bad representations go unchallenged.
I can't say I've watched much of it, but from what I gather, it's why Star Trek is so popular among, especially the next generation. So it's popular at least amongst some of the autistic people I know. Is because there's so many people in it who, rather than going, right, how can we find a way around, like, how can we try to find a fixing your disability? And that can be anything from if you're blind, if you're, what they go is, what we'll do is we'll just give you a thing to help, and it will be the norm. Like, I think there's one character that has like a visor, and and it's just, so rather than going, oh, we need to try and correct it, it's just, we'll give you an accommodation for it, and then everyone treats you the exact same way.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's not a fandom I've really delved into, but from what I gather, it's why that things like that are why it is so widely respected.
I think, I mean, going to the Big Bang Theory, one of the things what pisses me off most about that show is the amount of accommodation everybody allows Sheldon. When, in my experience, nobody gives any regard to help or to accommodate my particular needs. And I try to communicate what I need. Nobody gives a crap. And everybody in that show bends over backwards to accommodate Sheldon Cooper. And, you know, they're like, well, yes, he sits there. Yes, he does that. Yes, he does that. Whereas I'm repeatedly told, even though I feel uncomfortable when I'm, it's normally you have your routine and everything. Someone throws out the routine. It's very tricky sometimes. I have to adapt to that. Nobody gives a crap about me having to adapt. Nobody makes any special allowance for that. And I think that one important thing is when you're writing a character who is neurodivergent, you need to be mindful of how you write the people around them as well. And I think that, because obviously if someone does something, it has ripples. And you know, I mean, yeah, you can get the character right, but what's their family's reaction to that? What's their friends' reaction to that? And are they realistic reactions, or are they a fantasy reaction of what we think people should do? And it's like, okay, so I was reading about Wednesday, the character, okay, obviously quite a recent one, and there was a young autistic woman who spoke up about this and said that, you know, Wednesday is now causing she's everybody's favourite character, and, you know, but the people who are now saying Wednesday's my favourite character were making fun of me at school for exhibiting exactly the same behaviours, because in real life, people don't make accommodation. And I find that very difficult, like at work, in workplaces, they can say, oh yes, well definitely, you know, like when they're talking about the subject, they're incredibly supportive. But then when it's out of context and you're no longer talking about that subject and you display a behaviour, they don't like it anymore, and it's not convenient for them at that point. And yeah, that just pisses me off about Sheldon Cooper. Like, and also our bed as well. Everybody looks after our bed. You know, in community, and you know, I love our bed, but is that realistic, really? I just, you know.
Well, the one thing I would say about the Big Bang Theory is I think it's more realistic about what it's like to be a carer than it is about what it's like to be a neurodivergent person, because I would say it's very much the sitcom family tradition, and like the idea of Sheldon having a spot that nobody touches and Sheldon doing things that everybody in his orbit just accepts. Yeah, there's stuff in our house that we don't do because my son would get upset about them. And there's stuff that we do that he is the only one who wants to do them, but he wants to do them, so we do them. I mean, my husband is looking after him this weekend, and boy, has he ridden on a lot of trains. Just for the sake of riding on trains. He took him to the zoo purely so he could photograph the toilets. So I would say the Big Bang Theory presents a friend group as if it were a functional family, which is, I might attribute that to the sitcom format, but I don't know if anyone would.
I mean, I don't know what you guys think, but it's one of the reasons I don't wear the sunflower lanyard, because I mean I'm completely for it. I have one, but actually I find it make people treat you as special, not accommodating. As in, I tend to only wear it when I'm doing travel that stresses me out. So when I'm on trains. And I was going up to Durham, so I had to change at Leeds, and I was just really concerned about getting the right train set during the change. And I just went, can you help me? And I just showed him, and he went, what's that mean? And it was kind of like, he didn't mean it like he didn't know what it meant, he just meant like, you think you're special, that kind of, what you mean. And so actually, it feels like it's more I mean, I respect people who wear it, but it's kind of, for me, the only experience I've had is it kind of invites people to mock the fact that you've got one, because they think you're special.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know whether, like, do people have similar experiences, but I mean, I found that when I have tried to push representation in the most obvious ways, it's come back to just bite me on the ass.
Yeah, as personal experiences, there are no accommodations for anything. I mean, I'm about to get on a train. I had a hellish train ride up here. I can't stand for that long, and yet I was supposed to stand for 3 hours, which left me with fatigue, and never mind the stress of the scheduling and the organising to even get me on the train. So a journey became entirely exhausting, and I'm about to have another journey home, but no, there are no accommodations. I mean, I don't know what the answer is in terms of when you think about representation in writing. On a general level, I think there are lots of different kinds of stories. So we could either, whatever we're talking about in terms of representation, we could either write about it in a way that feels realistic, socially, or we can also write a story that might be a world that we would imagine that we might want as well. And I think that both of those things personally feel like they're all valid, and that but they are just different kinds of stories. how people perceive stories is how people perceive stories. I don't know. It's something that's coming a lot in terms of queer representation. Do we, do you incorporate homophobia into a story, or do you have a story where there is, broad representation on various gender diversities and sexualities and so on and so on? One is not looking like the world that we live in, and one is looking like the world that we live in. So I'm not sure what I think about the answer to that. I completely understand your point.
Maybe it's because I'm a grim dark writer. Everything's dark.
Maybe the key bit is though that we're talking about it. Like for instance, take the Olympics and transgender people in sport. It's kind of like, actually, I don't know the answer. I'm not saying anyone does know the answer, but surely the important bit is that we're talking about it and at least agreeing that there isn't one answer. And so the important thing is that we're talking about it and realising there is more than just one very neurotypical, if we're taking this example, neurotypical, this is how it's done answer. Isn't the important thing that we're going, we don't know the answer, let's try and look at it.
I think one interesting point is about lens. What you were saying about lens. Whose lens are we looking at? And what might I can't remember exactly what you were saying, so I apologise. But just that lens and that perspective. So if you're writing about something different to your own experiences, being really mindful about the fact that you don't get to put your own biases on that. You need to do some really good research and make it clear which lens you're coming at from different characters. Not all of our characters are nice people, and not all, but yeah, being clear about what we're writing.
I think, sorry, I'm gonna say we're getting to the end, and I just wanted to open the floor to some questions, because I know this gentleman has already put his hand up.
How do you view the neurodivergent portrayal of love, intimacy, and sexuality in regular
In like romantic
novels?
sense?
Yeah, regular
okay.
novels. How do you see
How-
that
okay.
type of portrayal?
I'm going to repeat that back for people on the thing. Nod if I've got it right. The portrayal of romantic sort of relationships in neurodivergent.
No. How do the neurodivergent view the portrayal of romance and sexuality in non-neurodivergent writers' novel, the fiction?
Yeah. Okay, so how do neurodivergent people view normal normal relationships, neurotypical relationships in media?
I don't think I'm neurodivergent enough to be qualified to answer that, but I'm not quite sure how it's relevant.
Well, I mean, I'm demisexual as well. At least that's what I think. And I'm expecting my dad, who's over there about to nod at this, is that when we're watching horror films and there's usually a romance scene, I'll go, and look just very confused at it, like, why, what, why? I mean, I do that most of the time.
Better than you used to be. You used to go, oh no! Really, she's taking her top off again, Ben. It happens in B movies. Leave it alone.
And now we know my dad's opinion as well. So yeah, I do know the frustration side of going, what are these just not good, like kind of like, but, and like when people go, no, that actually happens, and people go like, but why? So it can be a bit just, or at least kind of wondering why the hell does it need to be included? That might be the cynic in me as well.
It's pandering to people like me.
Okay.
We're soppy.
I'm not sure it's entirely relevant for me, just in terms of mine being more about memory, so I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the only thing I would say is if there's misunderstandings going on, and for me, when approaching a romantic situation, I mean, I'm quite forthright in.
Just talk to each other.
Yes, exactly. It's the mystery side of things. I mean, it's not really a thing. You just say out loud very clearly and concisely. And looking back on my early experiences here and the typical moments that you get. I definitely threw some people off by being quite so forthright. Like, this is going to happen. This is not going to happen. And then being like, right. And I'm like, and we shall begin. And so, you know, this is very black and white, excellent. We lay down the ground rules, this is off the menu, excellent, we're going. And yeah, apparently people find that a turn off.
People are weird.
People are so weird.
I can say my husband, who again has ADHD, he loves romance. He's very romantic. So he enjoys it. And again, I think there's more diversity of gender and sexuality among neurotypical people, among neurodivergent people than neurotypical people. Or it may just be that ND people are more willing to come out. But it does vary a lot, I think.
Maybe it's because we're all in our brains so much more conscious of, you know, and questioning the norms, always questioning the norms. I'm afraid time is up. Really sorry.
We could go for a long time on this otherwise.
Yeah, I think we could just carry on. I mean, as it's the last panel of the day, I was like, you know, but obviously
I've had sort of instructions from outside that we do need to vacate the room, but the bar is open downstairs. There's no reason why conversations can't continue.
absolutely, yeah. I mean, we can migrate, and yes. But thank you very much for coming, and thank you to my glorious panelists.
And our wonderful moderator.
His friends might have known it, and he might not have known it straight away.
Then why wasn't I diagnosed until I was 16?
Because services are not very good.
Yeah, well, yeah.
That is very true.
How about a parents?
See, in my family, because we're all weird as hell, nobody realised.
That's very true, yes.
Until the point where I basically couldn't function anymore.
That's not very good. You've got one person.
It's never one person.
You're weird like that because that's your uncle.
Get that off your dad, get that off your mom, get that off your
Oh,
auntie.
it's just like his uncle so-and-so.
I got my diagnosis and looked around my family went, you're autistic, you're ADHD. You're dyslexic, you have
Gregory
statistics.
is
The entire family.
actually, this is relevant. I'm a massive Chinese fan. It was a radio show first, and so.
Let's just do something like this until I start to do.
Oh, okay. Absolutely, yeah. Okay, well, sorry. That's all right. Sorry, cute whistle.
Oh yeah, she's a cutie. She's the best cat ever. I brought her with me because she's on medicine twice a day. Oh bless. Hello. Right, let's go pal. Let me help you with Callie. Because I'm sure she's not in weight.